Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming back for after lunch day 2, and honored to be here. And as Tanya mentioned, I spoke at the first StaffPlus back in 2021, but that was virtual, so it's a very different experience to be standing on a stage with all of you, and I think this is better. I'll be building on a lot of what my excellent fellow speakers have been talking about the past 2 days, and now that I've hooked you with my very clickbaity title, let's dive in. So you can't give a talk about standardization without this XKCD comic. So, let's just get this out of the way. When someone mentions that they'd like to develop a new standard in your organization, your first reaction should probably be, please don't, and have you tried everything else? Oftentimes, standardization efforts are not quick, and they are not easy, and they end up incomplete. And this diminishes usually why you might be doing this in the first place. But sometimes you really, really do need to establish a new standard and adopt it throughout your organization. So today I'm going to explore a little bit about what can go wrong and give you maybe some tools for deciding whether you should do it anyway and maybe how to avoid some of these traps. All right, so let's also get a little scope and terminology out of the way. You'll notice that I've spelled standardization with a Z. I'm American. I say Z. I spell words like this with Z's. But if that's too American for you, you can think of it as a Z. The English language is not standard, right? So French, on the other hand, has an academy. It's a recognized authority of language. It's sanctioned by the French government. Their core mission is to establish and update standards of the French language. But this talk is in English, so I can do whatever I want. It's really fun. So the rest of the talk, though, I'm going to focus on software-shaped standardization projects. These might include programming language style guides, where do you put your curly braces, programming frameworks, service architecture, do you use microservices, monoliths, and deployment standards. How do you, deploy code into your production environments? So why should we standardize things? Or maybe let's start with why I'm talking to you about this today. As Tanya mentioned, I'm a principal engineer at Google in our SRE organization, and we run a lot of really big and really visible services, which feels like a little bit of an understatement in some cases. In my 10 years in the organization, we've seen tools and patterns come and go. And we're kind of in an era, I would say, of standardization and convergence, and it's involved a lot of migrations of production systems and platforms across the company. So I've seen kind of a shift in how important this has been to an organization. So imagine that you have a friend and they are an artist and they give you a really nice print that they've made for your birthday or something, and you want to hang it up in your house. But it's got a very non-standard sized canvas. You don't want to cut it, maybe you'll ruin it. And you have a particular color in mind for what the frame is that you'd like to put this in. You can't find anything in the shops, and so you go look around a flea market or something. And there's a guy who sells frames that he takes from the recycling center, and you're looking for one that fits your exact specifications, and you don't find one. So you end up building your own. I think this happens a lot in software. This frame may someday itself end up in the flea market. But this experience makes you wonder why it's so hard to find non-standard frames in regular shops, and how it came to be that most prints are made in standard sizes that you can find frames for easily. When it comes to efficiently operating a production system, you'll need to avoid wandering around the flea market for too long to find your next frame. So this is a quote that many of you will have heard. To operate a distributed software system, you'll need to exist in a place where there are more cattle than there are pets. Recently decided to also call a non-standard production environment a petting zoo. I think it works well. You've likely heard this before, but what does it mean? So I think a good synonym may be industrialization. So you have a few kind of handcrafted artisanal configurations. You may have make the cost of losing any individual instance in your system or component in your system cheaper, either to maintain or to lose it or adding to it, you should make it as cheap as possible and maybe even free. So let's apply that concept to a distributed system. So it's cheaper to repaint a worn-out bike shed when you can, get a volume discount on yellow paint. You know how much paint each shed is going to need after you finish painting like the first one, and you reassign, your clients of your proverbial bike sheds to the other ones while you're painting one of them. And you can like reuse the position of the ladder, that you figured out on the first one when you paint the other ones. You also get like faster and more competent at painting these as you go along because you've done it before, so you've learned a lot as you've went. So by the end of the standardization effort, it should be cheaper and easier to extend functionality, make it useful in multiple components of the system. Even if it's specialized, even if this component is specialized in maybe some other ways. So your maintenance costs should go down. For example, like having one set of documentation about your control plane to maintain instead of one for every single component in your system might make things easier. Onboarding new people into your team should also become easier and cheaper and faster because maybe they've even worked on a very similar system that followed the same standard before they came to your team. And they will have context from that experience. So this sounds great, right? Of course, now you have new problems, right? So in addition to the already mentioned risks of standards proliferation, rather than the actual standardization of your system, if you don't finish your project, finding the right time to establish a new standard is difficult. There's probably no perfect time. And it's at least as hard as deciding when to introduce, an abstract interface class into your code, because now you have multiple different implementations that make sense for it, if not harder. So if you do it too early, you'll be missing out on learned experience about what kinds of tools you actually need and what those functionalities are and what works well and what doesn't for your system. And you'll end up having a lot of really abstract discussions that involve like hypothetical costs that you're trying to estimate, and you're going to be wrong about them, but you try anyway. And the benefits are more difficult to get alignment across all your different stakeholders on. On the other hand, if you wait too long to establish a standard, you're going to spend time eventually migrating all of your maybe existing diverse solutions that exist in your ecosystem to some new standard one. And these projects are difficult to do on production systems without collateral damage. Might cause an outage that you didn't expect. There'll definitely be bugs. And they inevitably become slogs. I think, and what I mean by that is, people will end up finding it difficult to continue to be motivated if they can't really figure out, what's left to be done and like how long is it going to take, and, you've kind of been in this state of additional complexity while you're in this partially migrated state for a really long time. I think an earlier speaker, sorry, I don't remember the name, had talked a bit about like how to think about, Sahil, I think, talked a lot about migrations. And there are many phases of migrations. There's a phase where you kind of figure out what you know about what's going to be hard. You can do some gap analysis. You can do some design work. You can think about change management, the order you're going to do everything in, sequencing, what the documentation is that needs to be updated. But you're always going to have some, problems you didn't anticipate or unknown unknowns that you discover as you go, in between spurts of progress, hopefully more forward than backward. You need to kind of have processes for identifying, blockers for what means that you should stop your migration or even roll back. You need to have tools for managing the rollout. These can be done manually, but you still at least need to probably have a playbook. You need ways of verifying that your migrated state is good and that it actually behaves the way you expected it to. And you need to be able to roll back, hopefully for the entire duration, every step of the way, all the way back to the beginning. But in practice, I know that sometimes you take what you can get. You can roll back at least one step. Migrations can become at least as complex as the systems usually that you're migrating between, like the old state and the new state. You've added an additional like temporal dimension and additional maybe control surfaces and management planes to like do your migration. So thinking about those the same way you'd think about any other production system, I think is a useful way to really take the gravity of how difficult these could be. This is one that I have noticed actually quite a lot, and I think it's really important. I think it depends a bit on your organization, but if you're going from an organization where everyone feels empowered to solve their own problems, either by building a tool or coming up with some solution just, by doing some research and fixing a bug themselves, and then you start telling them like, actually we have the standard now and everyone should just kind of follow the standard. And you do that enough times, you might end up having a weakened sense of ownership in terms of how strongly teams feel that like the infrastructure they run is actually theirs and that they're responsible for it. So if the standard solution is a great fit, this shouldn't be too painful, right? Because maybe the standard solution actually does just address a problem and they don't have to spend a lot of time thinking about it, and it can totally be a win. Someone else is now supposed to worry about your problems and fix them for you. But often there are gaps or there are things you need to work around to make it fit your specific situation. And over time, this I think can wear out a team's sense of responsibility and ownership for the problems that crop up in their systems. And that's especially true if there's no process to review and revisit like why previous standards were chosen, or choices or design patterns were selected by maybe more senior or tenured people in the organization who might not even be there anymore. And this is, in particular for newer team members who may not know why decisions were made or how they were made for reasons in the past. So, how does this play out in practice? When your team is good at solving its own problems, for both, I would say, good and bad reasons, you're used to maybe looking at a problem, designing, and then implementing a solution yourself. You don't need to talk to a lot of people. You can kind of make a decision within the team. You just kind of maybe you like chat about it a little bit with someone on your team, and they say, yeah, sounds good, and then you go do it. That third box could take a while, right? Some problems are faster and slower to solve, but it's kind of within the control of a small group of people. So sometimes standardization really does result in something this straightforward. When you have a bunch of great standard solutions easily available, and they'll solve your problem, I say go for it. They can, free up time for you to think about other problems that are maybe more important to your business. And when things go this way, they can move fast and add very little cognitive overhead. So I think this is closer to reality, at least in my experience, and there's probably other decision points that don't fit on this slide. I would love to hear about them at the office hours after this. You'll notice that there's just so many more decisions and decision points that you have to make versus like being able to do this within your own team. There's a lot more analysis. There might be more negotiation. There might be more kind of aligning on vision and all these other things that we've been talking about, like that staff engineers need to do all the time. What this ends up doing in practice, though, if you're not careful, is it can end up stifling innovation. If fewer problems result in people designing and implementing solutions to their problems, it starts to feel a little bit taboo that like a junior engineer looks at something and says like, oh, well, I'll just go fix this. And I think those skills end up kind of atrophying over time. And oftentimes I think it also leads to like people just kind of getting stuck at some point in this flow chart and then not actually solving the problems they have at all. And that's not something we want. So how do we make this less painful? So many previous speakers have mentioned this, but you should always be thinking about why you're doing something. Standards are not a solution to every problem. They are a solution to some problems. They may make other problems worse. You should be carefully considering like why you are doing this in the first place. It should create some kind of value that aligns with your organization's goals at the end of it. And that value should be really apparent in kind of how you're structuring the project. So making sure that everyone's aligned on why it's worth doing and what the benefits are and how you're going to measure that they actually happened at the end of it is really motivating, I think, to people working on what can end up being really long, multi-year projects that, as people have talked about. It's also helpful for motivating, us as ICs, like helping motivate management and other sponsors of these kinds of projects for like, if they're thinking like, oh man, like there are all these engineers working on this standardization project and they could be working on this like really shiny feature. This is also, I think, a really good way to help cement like why something like this is worth doing and that they should help make sure it actually completes. Moving towards a new standard should never, in my opinion, become like the majority of any team's time. I think team here is maybe a bit of a fuzzy thing because I think Suhail also mentioned you can have a central team that's kind of temporary while they work on a migration, and then they go back to kind of doing other things later. What I mean here is kind of like more of like a product team. If that product team ends up spending all their time on migrations and kind of infrastructure work, and I think as someone also had that time breakdown, I think Eamon, hopefully, about how much time are you spending on feature work, how much are you spending on bugs. You almost certainly don't want to make only tech debt reduction or standardization efforts be the majority of your time, because those are usually harder to see a direct link to like business output and business value. So, and that value should be ultimately helping you prioritize building well-designed systems that can support that business value in the first place. So I think the next thing is to carefully consider who should be doing the standardization work. Again, Suhail touched on this in the context of running large-scale migrations yesterday. I think as much as possible, if service-specific knowledge or component-specific knowledge isn't necessary, having one group of people, a small group of people who like really know what the new, what the migration path looks like, and they know a lot about what the changes that needs to be made, centralize as much of the work on those people as possible. But if service-specific gotchas kind of exist, you should make it easy for teams to do standardization work themselves. Give them tools, give them reporting, give them other migration tools, and maybe the time and availability of subject matter experts to answer questions about the changes that are being pushed across the organization. As much as possible, automate and drive these kinds of migrations, and especially if there's more teams that have to do it, because that way you can avoid having a bunch of different people in different teams spend a lot of time like learning about how to do this migration safely. As a rule of thumb, my organization has a churn policy, which says that any migration that goes kind of wide enough across the company, the central group must do at least 80% of the kind of committed engineering time that goes into making that happen. And any individual or client team that has to participate in it anyway should spend no more than 20%. And I think that's a bit low. I think actually the central team should be always aiming to do as much of it as possible, but 80% is kind of the floor there. This also has come up before. So figuring out who owns what, or what the boundaries of ownership are, super important. Like if you don't have clear ownership over different parts of kind of a platform solution, or does the client team need to go fix this themselves? Each time a new problem comes up, you can end up spending a lot of time like in this awkward phase where you're like, well, my team could fix it, but maybe this other team thinks it's their problem and they were actually planning to fix it anyway, and you have to kind of figure out all these things. It can even become kind of political problems, I think, in some organizations. If you have, oh, this was on our roadmap, but this other team thinks you're not going fast enough, and, this can create more problems later. So, and as also has been mentioned, people really like solving, if we're software engineers, probably you like solving your own problem with code. That's more fun. But I think catching this earlier on by having regular discussions about realistic goals and non-goals and ownership kind of boundaries with all the stakeholders in a particular engagement, whether you're a platform team or a client of a platform team, on a regular basis is a good way to make sure this isn't surprising when you do have something you need from them. Yeah, Maria also talked about this earlier. So thinking about how decisions are made in your organization is super useful. And I think also I'll mention, like, consider how easy it is to change a decision later or undo a decision. I think, one way is to have things be top down, like the most senior person in the room might like frame the problem and say like, okay, because of X, Y, and Z, I say that we should now do X. That person might have, more of that broad context and the vision and know things that maybe someone on kind of as a more junior IC would know. And they might have that context to better prioritize problems that the organization should be working on. But they might also be missing things. So there still are some downsides to that approach. And kind of, again, back to that like ownership thing, I think you want to be careful that as a senior person, you're not taking away a feeling of ownership over the fate of someone's system if there's not a really, really good reason for you to be doing that. So the other way is bottoms up. This works great when the scope of the decision is like one team. There's usually probably no reason at that point for someone to say like, you're the first team that's had this problem, but I would like to set a standard for an organization that has 50 teams in it, and like I will take that decision away from you. Maybe instead just let the team decide what makes sense for them. So, maybe you want a blend of the two. I think generally when you're making decisions that are difficult to undo later, you might want to have some more senior people involved in helping make sure that that decision isn't going to be something you regret later. But most importantly is like one level more meta, which is decide how you're going to decide. So another thing about standardization projects is that you can kind of do them more and less completely. So I think it's also worth considering at the beginning, like how are you going to structure the commitment towards the goal you have of maybe complete standardization of your ecosystem. I would say the first step usually is to do it opportunistically. Maybe there's a new platform, you don't tell everyone they have to use it yet, but you do end up making it available and you see how it goes, and then the platform team can learn from those first few adoptees and make things better. But basically what I mean by opportunistically is, if a new service is turned up, like it uses the new thing, but you don't spend a lot of time like migrating old things. Maybe you also do it, when you either turn down or otherwise like completely refactor an old system, or just like whenever you have extra staffing, like, oh, there's a couple of people who finished this feature a week early and now they're going to maybe work on this migration. But sometimes you want to do it kind of completely, and you see the value of like, well, the biggest payoff for this is when we've done it for everything in this category. And that can make sense when it's a relatively small effort to do so, or when the cost of not doing it becomes too big. And that's obviously something that would be lovely to measure, but is often difficult to do so. So, there's a lot of judgment that I think comes into these kinds of decisions. The other reason, and kind of with that, is sometimes the benefits of doing these standardizations only appear at the end. So if you're like that XKCD comment, you started off with 5 standards. If you do another one, 6th one, just like halfway, well, now you've just made the problem worse. So carefully consider like which of these approaches or which blend or sequence of these approaches might work for you. So with all this being said, is it worth it? Should you standardize things in a large organization? I'd say yeah. Generally, that's like a good instinct to have, with all the caveats I previously mentioned. So for an organization that's looking to make use of efficient use of resources, whether that's engineering time or resource costs or operational costs or licensing costs, there are likely some things that could benefit from having a shared standard, and that is something that is, as StaffPlus ICs, this is kind of something that I think we can provide a lot of value for. In the long run, standardizing your ecosystem, I think, should very clearly pay off. Sometimes the long run is very long. A migration for a large system I've worked on recently completed a mere 8 years since the prototype version of it was up and running. And, everyone seems to feel like it was worth it. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I wish you the best in your endeavor to create more structure